Chapter 9 introduced you to the allowance method. So the allowance method has two different ways that a company can estimate the uncollectible amount of their accounts receivable. They could either go with the percentage of sales basis, or they could go with the percentage of receivables basis. So we're going to work through an example problem here for both percentage of sales and percentage of receivables. First, with percentage of sales. So Dryden Inc. elects to use the percentage of sales basis. It decides that 2% of their net sales will be uncollectible. Sales revenue for 2019 was $700,000. Sales returns and allowances were $30,000, and allowance for doubtful accounts had a credit balance of $4,000. We need to journalize the adjusting entry to estimate the uncollectible amount. So we have all the information up at the top. We need to figure out net sales because we're told that 2% of our net sales will be uncollectible. So net sales will be our sales revenue minus our returns and allowances. So if we plug in our numbers, 700,000 minus 30,000, and we find that our net sales are 670,000. Well, now we need to figure out 2% of that, because 2% of that will be uncollectible. So 2% of 670,000, so we multiply 670 times 0.02, and we see that 2% of our net sales is 13,400. Now, we had another piece of information here, the credit balance in your allowance for doubtful accounts. Well, when we're dealing with percentage of sales, we don't worry about that. We don't worry about the balance in allowance for doubtful accounts. We only are concerned about that balance when we're doing percentage of receivables. So that will come up in the next part of this problem. So now we have everything that we need to start working on the journal entry. So our journal entry for percentage of sales or percentage of receivables will be a debit to bad debt expense and a credit to allowance for doubtful accounts. Now we need to figure out what's the number that we use here. Well, we decided that 2% of our net sales will be uncollectible. So that 2% number, the 13,400, is what we debit bad debt expense for, and we credit allowance for doubtful accounts. Now we can look at the percentage of receivables. So Gillespie LLC elects to use the percentage of receivables basis. It decides that 8% of their accounts receivable will be uncollectible. Their accounts receivable balance is $200,000, and their allowance for doubtful accounts had a $4,000 credit balance. So again, we need to journalize the adjusting entry to estimate the uncollectible amount. So we have the information up at the top, right? 8% of accounts receivable will be uncollectible and our balances. So we need to figure out 8% of our accounts receivable. So our accounts receivable balance is $200,000. So we'll take that $200,000 and multiply it by 8% or 0.08. And we see that 8% of our accounts receivable is $16,000. Now, we can't just take that $16,000 and put it in our entry and move on with our day. We need to take into consideration this $4,000 credit balance in our allowance for doubtful accounts. So, we make a T account for allowance for doubtful accounts. And it started off with this $4,000 credit balance. So we put the $4,000 in there. That $16,000 that we found, that's what we want the ending balance to be in our allowance for doubtful accounts. We want to go from $4,000 to $16,000. So, the adjusting entry that we need to make is going to be for whatever that number is in that red circle. Well, to go from $4,000 to $16,000, we need to credit an additional $12,000. So our journal entry, the framework is going to look the same. The debit to bad debt expense and the credit to allowance for doubtful accounts. And the number that we're going to use in this entry is 12,000 because we need to adjust our allowance for doubtful accounts by 12,000. Now, let's shift it a little bit and say that allowance for doubtful accounts had a $1,000 debit balance instead of that credit balance that it had in the previous problem. Well, we still need to figure out 8% of accounts receivable, right? So we still go through that step to get our 16,000. This is where the change now comes into play. Our T account now shows a $1,000 debit balance for allowance for doubtful accounts. But we want to end with a credit balance of 16,000. So, how do we go from a $1,000 debit balance to a 16,000 credit balance? Well, we're going to need to credit something. And what are we going to need to credit? 17,000. So we add those two together, the 16 and the 1, to get our 17,000 that we need to credit our allowance for doubtful accounts. So now our journal entry. It looks just like the other two journal entries that we've made, right? We debit bad debt expense and we credit allowance for doubtful accounts. And for how much? The 17,000 that we need to adjust our allowance for doubtful accounts for.